Hey guys, I hope you don't mind, but I thought I'd do another personal stories episode off the back of phone calls from the dead. I hadn't intended to do this, but after reading Simon's script for that episode, I was shocked at how similar some of the stories were to something which occurred within my own family. I had no idea how common the apparent phenomenon is of receiving a communication from someone who has passed away. And somewhere in the process of editing that script, I had an urge to relate the experience I'm about to share with you, which may end up sounding crazy, but it's something that's deeply personal to me, and especially to my mum, who felt the full force of what she believes is a true example of life after death. None of what you are about to hear is really dark or creepy, but instead something life-affirming and hopeful in the face of a tragic loss. As some of you may or may not know, I come from a fairly large family. I grew up with 4 brothers and a sister, and during the course of my life I have lost 2 of those siblings. My sister Michelle died in 1987 at the age of 19. I think I was about 5 at the time, so I didn't really understand what was going on. And then more recently, in 2014, my brother Adrian passed away at the age of 34. Now, strangely enough, they both died of the same thing, which was epilepsy. They both had grand mal seizures whilst they were on their own, and sadly no one was there to help them. It's not a condition that runs in my family. My sister's epilepsy just came out of nowhere, and my brother, well, he sustained a nasty head injury in 2012, from which he then developed very intense seizures. So that's how they both passed away, and I guess in a poetic sort of way, they were uncannily similar to each other in terms of their characters and personalities. In both cases, my mum experienced some very strange occurrences after they died, and in this instance I'm just going to focus on what happened after Adrian passed away, as it's still quite fresh in my memory. And depending on how you feel about this, maybe I'll share what happened with Michelle too at some point. Now, I've said a couple of times before that Bedtime Stories is very much a dedication to Aid. He was an artist himself, and he had an amazing talent for drawing pencil and charcoal style scenes and characters. And going back almost 20 years, he and I had this idea to write creepy stories and put them on a website, with him doing a drawing for each one. But as the saying goes, life gets in the way of making other plans, and we just never got around to realising this dream we both had, which is why I made the decision to push ahead with Bedtime Stories after he had gone. But that was, for all intents and purposes, the genesis of what you are listening to at this moment in time. Now, the first few days after he passed, we spent clearing out his house. Most of his belongings were boxed up and kept in the spare room at my mum's house, ready to be put up in the attic. But they ended up staying in that room for months. I guess none of us were quite ready to deal with that process. It would have felt like we were putting Aid away in the dark to be forgotten about, and that just didn't seem right. Anyway, about 4 weeks after the funeral, so 5 or 6 weeks after his death, my mum is pottering around in the kitchen when she hears this vibrating sound. Now, straight away she knows it's a mobile phone, but when she checks hers, which is on the kitchen table beside her, she can see that the screen is blank, so it's not hers that's ringing. And after a few seconds she realises that it's coming from above her head. So she heads upstairs, and upon entering the spare room, which is above the kitchen, the sound becomes more pronounced. So she starts going through the boxes of Aid's belongings, and in the first one she opens is his mobile phone, screen lit up with private number on the display. Now, I should mention that nobody had touched Aid's phone since he had died, except for in the first few days when we went through it to call his friends and let them know what had happened. Otherwise, it had been sitting in that box for 6 weeks, and by rights it should have been completely dead. Even back then, smartphones would only last a couple of days tops, even if you kept them in standby mode, so that was the first strange thing. The second is that when my mum answered it, there was no one there. It was just silence, apart from a couple of almost inaudible clicks on the line, so she cancelled out of the call. But almost immediately after pressing the button to hang up, it starts ringing again. And this time the name of Aid's girlfriend comes up on the screen. So my mum answers, and there's Aid's girlfriend on the other end of the line, almost hysterical, saying, "Aid, is that you? Are you there?" And of course my mum says that it's not Aid, it's his mum, and then she asks his girlfriend if it was her just now trying to call Aid's phone from a private number. To which his girlfriend says, "No, I just got a missed call from Aid's phone, and when I rang back, you answered." And obviously my mum tells her that that's impossible, as Aid's phone has been in the box all this time and that no one has even been near it, so she doesn't understand how the phone has called his girlfriend. Anyway, they ended up having a lengthy conversation reminiscing about Aid, which my mum found a certain degree of, I guess, closure in. Afterwards they said their goodbyes and they never spoke again. As soon as my mum hung up, the phone went blank, out of battery, as if it had never been powered on. And to this day she's convinced that somehow Aid wanted the two of them to speak. But this wasn't the only time that something like this happened after Aid passed. In fact, it wasn't even the first. My mum is adamant that he contacted her twice before his funeral, only this time it wasn't through a phone or electronic device of any kind. About a week before the service was due to take place, my mum was stressing over what to put in Aid's coffin with him. There was nothing really in his belongings of any kind of sentimental value, and she was getting quite upset about not having anything to give to him. Anyway, one of the nights she's awoken in the early hours of the morning by what she said felt like a hammer banging inside her head, and there's this voice which says, "Picture, top of cupboard, picture, top of cupboard." And it's just like that, the way my mum described it. She says it was like a hammer blow with each syllable. So the next day I get a phone call from my mum saying we need to go to Aid's house because she thinks there's something we might have missed. I tell her, "Look mum, we cleared everything out. How could we have missed anything?" And that we have to hand the keys back in a couple of days. But she's not having any of it. She's convinced that there's something of Aid's still in that house. So later that day I drive her over there and we check every cupboard in the place, top to bottom, and there's nothing there. We don't find anything. And just as we're about to leave, my mum, who's close to tears as she was convinced we would find whatever we were supposed to find, points to the kitchen cupboards and says, "Did you check up there?" Now these cupboards are attached to the kitchen wall in such a way that there is something like a 2-inch gap between the ceiling and the top of the cupboard itself. It's not the kind of place you'd ever think to store something, so I kind of bite my tongue and climb up onto the work surface. And on top of the very first cupboard I check, I can see that there's something there. So I slide it out of there, and when I see what it is, I just stand there in shock for a few seconds and turn to look at my mum. And when I pass it to her, she looks at it, puts a hand over her mouth and just begins to weep. It's a picture of Aid's son, sitting there with this big cheeky smile on his face. Only Aid would have known where that picture was. It was something that was precious to him, and that's why he'd put it away in such an obscure place where no one else would think to look, which is why we didn't find it when we cleared out the house the first time. And we never would have found it if my mum hadn't been told to look on top of the cupboard. So that's what my mum ended up putting in the coffin with him. Now, believe it or not, the same thing happened again a few days later, and this time it was to do with which song to pick for the service. We were supposed to select 3, and we'd already chosen 2, but we were struggling with the third. We didn't know what to choose. And again, my mum was awoken in the early hours with the same hammering sensation, but this time it was Cyndi Lauper, True Colours. Cyndi Lauper, True Colours. Same rhythmical hammer blows with each syllable. Now, as soon as my mum told me, I couldn't believe it. I said, Cyndi Lauper? I said, there's no way Aid would choose something like that. You know, like me, he was a rock and indie kind of guy. Never in a million years would you catch him listening to Cyndi bloody Lauper. And I couldn't even accuse my mum of picking it for him because she detests anything like that. She's into, you know, Beatles, Rolling Stones, Led Zeppelin, that kind of music. So it was just a completely random song way out of left field, which didn't seem to make any sense until we read the lyrics. And when it came on at the service after I delivered Aid's eulogy, the tears just wouldn't stop. My mum's also seen him a few times around the house. Occasionally she'll walk around a corner and see the back of him walking through a door, or turn to see him sitting in a chair, only for him to disappear when she double takes. And just a couple of weeks ago, when we were visiting my mum for Sunday dinner, my partner saw his outline behind a frosted screen door as she came out of the bathroom. And even I saw him briefly after my twin boys were born in 2018. In my old house, we had a corner sofa, and I just put my newborn son, William, down to sleep on the corner piece next to me, surrounded by cushions so that he couldn't, roll off. And I was tired myself due to the lack of sleep me and my partner were having, which was understandable given the situation. And so I lay down on the sofa near him and just dozed off. And just as I woke up, I saw Aid on the adjacent section of the sofa, arm resting on the back, leaning in towards William. And he just smiled at me and then faded away. And it was really quick. It was, about a second or two. And it was like he was watching over my son as I slept. And I'd always put it down to like a waking dream, but the more I think about it, the more I doubt that as an explanation, because waking dreams only occur when coming out of deep REM sleep, and it takes around an hour or two of dreamless sleep before the body even enters the REM phase. And I'd only been napping for around 10 or 15 minutes, so I don't know what to think. My mum, on the other hand, is utterly convinced that Aid had contacted her in all 3 of the aforementioned instances. Now, of course, I never received any of these communications myself, so I can't speak for what my mum experienced. Was it all in her head? Was it just wishful thinking? Her way of coping with yet another loss of one of her children? I don't know. But I do believe her. But then, of course, I want it to be true. Even need it to be true. Skeptical as I am about most paranormal things, I just can't bring myself to accept that there's nothing after death. It just makes life seem so trivial and pointless. When I went back to work a few weeks later, after Aid had passed away, a guy I barely knew who worked over the other side of the office came over and spoke to me, and he told me that many years ago he'd lost his 7-year-old daughter. And the one thing he said which has stuck with me is that time's a great healer. You'll never fully mend, but it does get easier. And with that he walked away. The thing is, I feel like Aid's still around, and I think anybody who's lost someone close to them will tell you the same thing. Even now, sometimes for the briefest of moments, I'll think about, giving him a call and seeing if he wants to go for a beer and maybe a game of pool. And then I realise and I just feel sad. Like all brothers, you know, we'd fight a lot and argue over stupid things. But many of my most cherished memories were created with him. He was responsible for some of the funniest moments in my life and some of the most heartbreaking. He was my best friend and I miss him. I just hope I get to see him again one day.